Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the distant past in calm, measured detail to help you drift into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we journey back over 3,500 years to the sun-drenched island of Crete, where Europe's first great civilization flourished in an age of myth and legend. This is the story of the Minoans, a Bronze Age people whose magnificent palaces, mysterious writing systems, and enigmatic culture have captivated archaeologists and historians for over a century. So settle into a comfortable position, close your eyes if you wish, and let us transport you to a world of labyrinthine corridors, sacred bulls, and priestess queens, as we uncover the rise and fall of the Minoan civilization. If you enjoy tonight's story through history, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel grow and ensure I can continue to create these quiet spaces for you. Chapter 1: The Awakening of Crete. Long before the classical Greeks built the Parthenon, before Rome was even a village on the Tiber River, a sophisticated civilization flourished on the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea. The Minoans, as we call them today, emerged from the Neolithic period around 3650 before the Common Era, though their civilization would not reach its height for another millennium and a half. The island of Crete itself is a land of remarkable contrasts, stretching approximately 160 miles from east to west and varying between 7 and 35 miles in width. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands. Mountain ranges dominate the landscape, with Mount Ida rising to 8,058 feet, standing as the island's highest peak. These mountains divide the island into distinct regions, creating natural barriers that would influence settlement patterns throughout Minoan history. But Crete was blessed with more than just dramatic topography. Fertile valleys nestled between the mountains provided excellent land for agriculture. The northern coast offered numerous natural harbours, while the southern coast, though more rugged, still provided access to the sea. This combination of agricultural potential and maritime access would prove crucial to Minoan development. The climate of Crete was, and remains, typically Mediterranean. Hot, dry summers alternate with mild, wet winters. The island receives most of its rainfall between October and March, providing moisture for crops during the growing season. This climate allowed the ancient Minoans to cultivate a variety of crops, including wheat, barley, grapes, olives, and figs. The olive tree, in particular, would become central to Minoan economy and culture. The first humans arrived on Crete during the Neolithic period, sometime around 7,000 before the Common Era. These early settlers brought with them domesticated animals including sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. They also brought seed stock for wheat and barley. These Neolithic Cretans lived in small villages, crafted simple pottery, and began the long process of transforming the island's landscape through agriculture. For thousands of years, these Neolithic communities developed slowly. They built simple mud brick houses, created increasingly sophisticated pottery, and gradually expanded their settlements. But around 3000 before the Common Era, something began to change. Whether through new waves of immigration, cultural innovation, or a combination of factors, Crete began its transformation from a backwater of simple farming villages into something far more complex. The period from approximately 3000 to 2100 before the Common Era is known to archaeologists as the early Minoan period. During these 9 centuries, the foundations of Minoan civilization were laid. Population increased significantly, villages grew into towns. Pottery became more refined, with craftspeople developing new techniques and styles. The Minoans began working with bronze, the revolutionary alloy of copper and tin that gives this entire era its name. Trade networks began to expand during the early Minoan period. The Minoans were not alone in the eastern Mediterranean. To the south, Egypt's old kingdom was building the Great Pyramids. To the east, civilizations flourished in the Levant and Mesopotamia. To the north, communities dotted the Aegean islands and the Greek mainland. The Minoans began to trade with these neighbours, exchanging Cretan goods for foreign materials and ideas. One of the most significant developments of the early Minoan period was the appearance of what archaeologists call the first palace period's precursors. While the great palaces had not yet been built, certain settlements began to show signs of centralization. Larger buildings appeared, suggesting emerging social hierarchies. Storage facilities increased in size and sophistication, indicating more complex economic organization. The town of Knossos, located in north-central Crete, a few miles from the modern city of Heraklion, was already becoming important during this period. The site had been occupied since Neolithic times, but now it was growing rapidly. The settlement sprawled across several acres, its houses clustered together in an increasingly urban pattern. Similar growth occurred at other sites across the island, including Phaistos in the south, Malea on the north coast, and Zakros in the east. During the later part of the early Minoan period, specifically from around 2500 to 2100 before the Common Era, known as early Minoan II and III, we see increasing evidence of social stratification. Burial practices became more elaborate at some sites, with certain individuals receiving grave goods of much higher quality than others. These elite burials included items made from precious materials like gold, silver, and ivory, suggesting the emergence of a wealthy upper class. The Minoans of this period were also developing their artistic traditions. They created pottery with increasingly complex designs, including spiral patterns that would remain popular throughout Minoan history. They carved stone vessels with remarkable skill, creating bowls, jars, and other containers from materials like marble and serpentine. Some of these stone vessels were incredibly thin-walled, a testament to the craftspeople's skill. Metalworking advanced significantly during the early Minoan period. The Minoans learned to create not just simple bronze tools and weapons, but also elaborate jewelry and decorative items. Gold and silver were worked into intricate designs. The techniques of granulation, where tiny gold beads are fused to a surface to create patterns, and filigree, where fine wires are twisted and shaped into designs, both appeared during this period. The Minoans also began to engage in long-distance trade on a more systematic basis. Cretan pottery has been found at sites in Egypt, the Levant, and throughout the Aegean. Foreign goods, including Egyptian stone vessels, Syrian pottery, and Cycladic marble figurines, appear in Cretan contexts. This trade was not merely in luxury goods. The Minoans imported tin, which does not occur naturally on Crete, to mix with local copper to make bronze. They imported obsidian, volcanic glass valued for making sharp tools, from the island of Melos in the Cyclades. Religion, during the early Minoan period, remains somewhat mysterious. as is true of Minoan religion throughout their history. However, we can see certain practices emerging. Peak sanctuaries, religious sites located on mountain tops, began to appear. These would become important features of Minoan religion. Cave sanctuaries also continued to be used, a practice that dated back to the Neolithic period. At these sites, worshippers left votive offerings, including clay figurines, both human and animal. The transition from the early Minoan to the middle Minoan period, around 2100 to 2000 before the Common Era, was marked by significant changes. This period saw what some scholars have called the First Palace period, though this terminology is debated. What is clear is that around this time, the first monumental buildings appeared at the major Minoan centres. These proto-palaces were substantial structures, much larger than anything built before on Crete. They featured large courtyards, storage magazines with rows of massive jars called pitoi, and multiple stories. The buildings were constructed using stone foundations with mud brick upper stories and wooden columns. While less elaborate than the palaces that would follow, these buildings represented a major leap in architectural ambition and organizational capacity. The appearance of these early palatial structures suggests significant changes in Minoan society. Someone had to organize the labor to build these structures. Someone had to plan their layout and supervise construction. Someone had to fill their storage magazines with agricultural surplus. All of this points to an increasingly centralized, hierarchical society. Around 1900 to 1700 before the Common Era, disaster struck. Earthquakes, to which Crete has always been prone, destroyed the early palaces. Archaeological evidence from sites across Crete shows destruction layers from this period. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out in the ruins, and the early palatial centres were devastated. But the Minoans rebuilt, and they rebuilt on a scale and with a sophistication that surpassed everything that had come before. The destruction of the old palaces marked not an ending, but a transition to what would be the greatest period of Minoan civilization. Chapter 2: The Palace Civilization. The period from approximately 1700 to 1450 before the Common Era represents the height of Minoan civilization. This is the Neopalatial period, the age of the great palaces, when Minoan culture flourished across Crete and extended its influence throughout the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. After the destruction of the earlier palatial buildings, the Minoans rebuilt their centres with structures of unprecedented size, complexity, and beauty. These new palaces were not simply royal residences, though they certainly served that function. They were administrative centres, religious sanctuaries, economic hubs, and artistic showcases all combined into single architectural complexes. The Palace of Knossos, excavated and controversially reconstructed by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, is the largest and most famous of these structures. The palace covered approximately 20,000 square meters and may have stood up to 5 stories tall in places. Its complex layout, with hundreds of rooms, corridors, and staircases seemingly arranged without clear plan, led Evans to associate it with the mythical labyrinth of King Minos. The central feature of Knossos, as with all Minoan palaces, was a large rectangular courtyard. At Knossos, this central court measured approximately 50 meters long by 25 meters wide. The courtyard was paved and seems to have been used for various ceremonial and perhaps public functions. All the major sections of the palace were oriented around this central space. To the west of the central court lay the formal, ceremonial areas of the palace. Here were located the throne room, with its carved gypsum throne still in place when Evans excavated it, and various shrine rooms decorated with religious symbols and imagery. Long corridors led to extensive storage magazines, where rows upon rows of pithoi, massive storage jars, held olive oil, wine, grain, and other commodities. These storage facilities give us some idea of the palace's economic power. Archaeologists have estimated that the magazines at Knossos could have held enough olive oil to fill approximately 400 large pithoi, representing a huge accumulation of wealth. The eastern wing of Knossos contained what appear to be residential quarters. Here, rooms were more elaborate, featuring the distinctive Minoan architectural elements. Light wells, open shafts that brought light and air to interior rooms, illuminated the spaces. A sophisticated drainage system with terracotta pipes and stone-lined channels carried away wastewater. Some rooms featured elaborate frescoes on their walls, depicting everything from religious ceremonies to natural scenes of plants and animals. The other major palaces of Crete followed similar organizational principles, though each had its own distinct character. The Palace of Phaistos, located on a ridge overlooking the Messara plain in south-central Crete, may have rivaled Knossos in importance. The palace complex at Phaistos was notable for its monumental entrance, with a grand staircase leading up to the west court. The central court at Phaistos was slightly smaller than at Knossos, but equally impressive, paved with large limestone slabs. The Palace of Malea, on the north coast east of Knossos, was the third of the major palatial centres. Malea appears to have been somewhat less elaborate than Knossos or Phaistos, but it followed the same basic architectural plan. One unique feature of Malea was a large circular stone structure in the west court, which may have been a threshing floor or perhaps served some ceremonial purpose. The Palace of Zakros, at the eastern end of Crete, was the fourth major palace, though it was significantly smaller than the others. Zakros's location made it ideally suited for trade with the east, with Egypt, the Levant, and Cyprus. The palace yielded remarkable finds when excavated, including rock crystal vessels and elephant tusks, evidence of its role in international trade. In addition to these four major palaces, smaller palatial structures existed at sites including Galatas, Petras, and Gornia. These may have served as regional administrative centres, subordinate to the major palaces, but controlling their own territories. The palaces were not isolated structures. Each was surrounded by a substantial town. At Knossos, houses spread out from the palace in all directions, creating an urban area that may have housed 10,000 or more people at the civilization's height. These towns were not haphazardly arranged. Streets were laid out with some planning. Buildings were constructed with attention to sanitation and water supply. At Knossos, a sophisticated water management system brought fresh water to the palace and town through terracotta pipes, while drainage systems carried away waste. The houses of ordinary Minoans in these palatial towns varied in size and elaboration, according to the wealth and status of their inhabitants. The houses of the elite might have multiple stories, numerous rooms, and fine decorations, including frescoes and elaborate floors. More modest houses were simpler, but still well constructed, with stone foundations and mud brick walls. One remarkable feature of Minoan architecture was the absence of fortifications. Unlike their contemporaries in many parts of the world, the Minoans did not surround their palaces and towns with defensive walls. There are no massive fortifications like those at Mycenae or Troy. This absence has led to much speculation about Minoan society. Some scholars have argued that it suggests the Minoans were a peaceful people, or that they relied on naval power for defence, making land fortifications unnecessary. Others have suggested that the palaces themselves, with their massive walls and controlled entrances, served defensive functions without need for separate fortifications. The palaces and towns of the Neopalatial period were lavishly decorated. Minoan artists created some of the most beautiful and distinctive art of the ancient world. Frescoes covered walls in palaces and elite houses. These were not simply decorative, they provide us with invaluable information about Minoan life, religion, and values. Minoan frescoes employed a technique where pigments were applied to wet plaster, causing them to bond with the wall surface as it dried. The artists used a relatively limited palette, primarily reds, yellows, blues, greens, black, and white, derived from natural minerals and organic materials. Despite this limited palette, they created remarkably lively and naturalistic scenes. Nature was a favourite subject of Minoan fresco painters. The bluebird fresco from Knossos depicts birds, possibly blue rock thrushes, in a rocky landscape dotted with flowering plants. The saffron gatherer fresco, also from Knossos, shows a figure, possibly a monkey or a blue-skinned deity, picking saffron crocuses. The marine-style frescoes featured dolphins, fish, and octopuses swimming in stylized seas, their tentacles curling in elegant spirals. Religious and ceremonial scenes were also common. The famous bull-leaping fresco from Knossos shows young athletes, both male and female, performing acrobatic feats over the back of a charging bull. This was not mere entertainment, but appears to have had ritual significance, as we shall explore later. The Parisian fresco, so called by its excavators, depicts a beautiful woman with elaborate hairstyle and makeup, possibly a priestess or goddess, participating in some ceremony. Processions were another common theme. The procession fresco from Knossos showed hundreds of figures, life-sized, carrying offerings, and moving towards some central ritual space. The famous Prince of the Lilies fresco, showing a male figure with an elaborate feathered headdress walking among lilies, was part of this processional scene. Minoan artists did not limit themselves to frescoes. They created elaborate pottery, advancing beyond the earlier styles to develop new techniques and decorative schemes. The Kamares ware of the earlier palatial period gave way to the marine style and floral style pottery of the Neopalatial period. Marine style pottery featured octopuses, nautiluses, and other sea creatures rendered in dark paint on light backgrounds, their tentacles and bodies flowing across the curved surfaces of the vessels. Floral-style pottery depicted elaborate plants, often with fantastical elements. Stone vase carving reached new heights during this period. Craftspeople created vessels of remarkable delicacy and beauty from stone, including serpentine, marble, obsidian, and rock crystal. The harvester vase from Hagia Triada, carved from black steatite, depicts a procession of agricultural workers carrying harvesting tools. The boxer rhyton from the same site shows boxers and bull leapers in relief. A rhyton shaped like a bull's head from Knossos, with gilded wooden horns and rock crystal eyes, demonstrates the combination of materials and techniques available to Minoan artists. Metalwork also flourished. Gold and silver were crafted into elaborate jewelry, including necklaces, bracelets, and rings. Many of these pieces featured religious imagery. Gold signet rings depicted goddesses, shrine scenes, and ritual activities. The level of detail achieved on these tiny surfaces is remarkable, suggesting the use of magnification, though how this was accomplished remains uncertain. The Minoans also created larger metal objects. Bronze was cast into tools, weapons, and ritual objects. Large bronze double axes, sacred symbols in Minoan religion, were created as votive offerings. Bronze figurines depicted worshippers with arms raised in prayer and deities receiving offerings. The Minoans developed writing systems during this period. The earliest, known as Cretan hieroglyphic, appeared around 2000 before the Common Era. This script, which used pictographic symbols, is still not fully understood. It was succeeded or supplemented by a script known as Linear A, which appeared around 1800 before the Common Era and was used throughout the Neo-Palatial period. Linear A consists of about 90 syllabic signs, plus logograms representing whole words or concepts and numerals. Despite many attempts at decipherment, Linear A remains undeciphered. We can read the numbers and understand the general context of many tablets which appear to be administrative records, but the language itself remains unknown. This is one of the great frustrations of Minoan archaeology. We have hundreds of Linear A inscriptions, but we cannot read them. What we do know is that Linear A was used primarily for administrative purposes. Tablets record agricultural products, livestock, personnel, and various commodities. The palace administrations used Linear A to keep track of their economic activities. The tablets themselves were made of clay and were meant to be temporary records. They survived only because they were baked hard when buildings burned, preserving them for modern archaeologists. The economic system recorded in these tablets was complex. The palaces served as central collection points for agricultural surplus. Farmers from surrounding territories brought their produce to the palaces. There it was recorded, stored, and later redistributed. Craftspeople working in palace workshops received rations of food. Religious personnel were supported by palace resources. This system is sometimes called a redistribution economy. However, the Minoan economy was not entirely controlled by the palaces. There is evidence of independent craftspeople and merchants operating outside the palace system. Workshops have been found in towns that appear to have been privately operated. Trade goods found in non-elite houses suggest that some families accumulated wealth through commerce. Trade was central to the Minoan economy and culture. The Minoans were master seafarers, and their ships sailed throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence of Minoan trade contacts extends from Egypt and the Levant in the south and east, to Sicily and southern Italy in the west, and throughout the Aegean to the north. In Egypt, Minoan pottery has been found at numerous sites. Egyptian tomb paintings depict foreigners called Keftiu, identified by scholars as Minoans, bringing gifts or tribute to the Egyptian pharaoh. These paintings show the Minoans wearing distinctive clothing, including colourful kilts and elaborate hairstyles, and carrying characteristic Minoan vessels and other goods. The relationship between Minoan, Crete and Egypt appears to have been significant. The Minoans imported Egyptian goods including stone vessels, faience objects, and possibly ideas and artistic motifs. They exported Cretan products including pottery, textiles, and olive oil. Whether this exchange was purely commercial or involved political relationships, such as tribute or gift exchange between rulers, remains debated. In the Aegean, Minoan influence was particularly strong. Minoan-style frescoes appear at sites on Santorini, also known as Thera, an island north of Crete. The site of Akrotiri on Santorini, buried by a volcanic eruption in the mid-2nd millennium before the Common Era, preserved remarkable frescoes that are clearly in the Minoan style, though with local elements. Whether Santorini was a Minoan colony, an independent community heavily influenced by Minoan culture, or something in between, remains uncertain. Minoan pottery and other goods appear at sites throughout the Cycladic Islands and on the Greek mainland. The relationship between Minoan Crete and the emerging Mycenaean civilization on the mainland would become increasingly important and complex during the later Minoan period. The Minoans themselves appear to have established trading posts and perhaps colonies at various points around the Mediterranean. A site on the island of Rhodes shows strong Minoan influence. Sites in western Anatolia have yielded Minoan goods. The extent of direct Minoan political control over these outposts versus cultural influence and trade relationships is difficult to determine from the archaeological evidence. Chapter 3. Religion and Ritual. Understanding Minoan religion presents particular challenges. We have no Minoan myths written down in their own words, no theological texts, no prayers or hymns that we can read. What we know comes from archaeological evidence, the remains of shrines and sanctuaries, religious imagery and art, and ritual objects. From these fragments, scholars have attempted to reconstruct Minoan religious beliefs and practices. The Minoans appear to have worshipped primarily goddesses rather than gods. Female deities dominate Minoan religious imagery. These goddesses are shown in various contexts and with various attributes, leading to debate about whether the Minoans worshipped one great goddess who took many forms or multiple distinct goddesses. The so-called snake goddess figurines from Knossos, dating to approximately 1600 before the Common Era, are among the most famous Minoan religious objects. These faience figurines, about 13 to 14 inches tall, depict women wearing elaborate tiered skirts and bodices that expose their breasts. They hold snakes in their outstretched hands. One wears a tall headdress, possibly indicating higher status or a different aspect of divinity. The significance of the snakes is debated. Snakes in many ancient Mediterranean cultures were associated with the earth, with regeneration due to their ability to shed their skin and with household protection. They may also have been connected with an underworld or chthonic aspect of religion. Other female figures in Minoan art are shown in various contexts that suggest religious significance. Some are depicted receiving offerings or presiding over rituals. Others are shown in nature settings, surrounded by animals or plants. The poppy goddess from Gazi wears a crown of opium poppies and raises her arms in a gesture that appears in much Minoan religious art. Male deities appear less frequently in Minoan religious imagery, but they are present. Some seal stones and rings show male figures who appear to be divine, sometimes associated with hunting or with agricultural abundance. One seal shows a male figure with a staff or spear standing among rearing animals. Whether these represent a god or gods, or perhaps human priests or rulers in ritual contexts, is uncertain. Young male figures, sometimes called Master of Animals, appear in some contexts, shown controlling or dominating wild beasts. This type of deity or sacred figure would later appear in other Mediterranean cultures, suggesting either cultural transmission or similar religious developments. The Minoans worshipped at various types of sacred sites. Peak sanctuaries, located on mountaintops, were among the most distinctive. These open-air sanctuaries have been identified at over 25 locations across Crete. The most extensively excavated, at Euctes near Knossos, shows evidence of offerings including clay figurines of humans and animals, bronze objects, and burnt animal bones from sacrifices. At peak sanctuaries, worshippers left votive offerings, possibly in thanks for answered prayers or in hope of divine favour. The clay figurines often depict worshippers themselves, arms raised in prayer. Animal figurines include cattle, sheep, and goats. Some human figurines show parts of the body, possibly left by worshippers seeking healing for those body parts. Cave sanctuaries continued to be used throughout the Minoan period, a practice dating back to Neolithic times. The cave of Eileithia near Knossos was associated with childbirth, suggesting that specific sanctuaries were dedicated to specific divine functions or deities. The cave at Psychro in eastern Crete, identified in modern times as the mythical birthplace of Zeus, though this identification is uncertain, was used throughout the Bronze Age. Offerings found in caves include pottery, bronze objects, and animal bones. Within the palaces and larger houses, shrines and sacred rooms served as places of worship. These pillar crypts, as some are called, featured large stone pillars that appear to have had religious significance. The pillars were sometimes marked with the sacred symbol of the double axe. In some pillar crypts, offering tables suggest that rituals were performed there. The double axe, called labris in later Greek, was one of the most important Minoan religious symbols. It appears in countless contexts, carved on pillars, depicted in frescoes, created as bronze votive offerings, and moulded in clay. Large double axes made of bronze, gold, or silver were clearly not functional tools, but sacred objects. Small double axes were apparently used to mark sacred spaces and objects. The significance of the double axe is uncertain. Some scholars connect it with a goddess or god, others with thunder or lightning, still others with sacrificial rituals. The double axe appears frequently in association with other religious symbols, including the sacred horns known as horns of consecration. Horns of consecration were stylized representations of bull horns made of various materials including stone, clay, and plaster. They topped shrines, appeared on altars, and were depicted in religious scenes. Their exact significance is debated, but they clearly marked sacred space and sacred objects. They may have been connected with bull sacrifice or with the bull as a sacred animal. The bull was indeed central to Minoan religion and ritual. Bull imagery pervades Minoan art. The bull-leaping frescoes show young athletes, both male and female, performing acrobatic feats over charging bulls. Some grasp the bull's horns, others vault over the bull's back, still others stand ready to catch the leaper. Whether these scenes depicted actual events or had symbolic or mythological significance is debated. If bull leaping was practiced, it was extraordinarily dangerous. Modern attempts to recreate the feats shown in the frescoes have found them difficult or impossible, leading some scholars to suggest that the frescoes depicted idealized or mythological events rather than reality. Others argue that highly trained athletes, perhaps dedicated to this ritual from youth, could have accomplished these feats. Bull sacrifice certainly occurred. Animal bones found at sanctuaries include those of cattle. Ritual vessels, shaped like bull heads, suggest the importance of bulls in ceremonial contexts. The bull may have represented masculine power and fertility, complementing the feminine divine figures. Other animals also had religious significance. Lions, though not native to Crete in historical times, appear in religious contexts. Griffins, mythological creatures with eagle heads and lion bodies, were depicted in throne rooms and shrines. Birds, particularly doves and swallows, appear in religious scenes and may have been associated with goddesses. Trees and plants also featured in Minoan religion. Some seal stones and rings show scenes of tree worship, with figures apparently venerating or shaking a sacred tree. Certain trees, perhaps particular individual trees in sacred groves, may have been considered dwelling places of deities or spirits. The pillar in pillar crypts may have been a stone substitute for a sacred tree. Rituals and ceremonies were elaborate. Processional frescoes show numerous figures in elaborate dress carrying offerings. These may represent actual ceremonies where large numbers of people participated in processions to sanctuaries or through palace courtyards. The central courts of the palaces were likely used for religious ceremonies witnessed by assembled crowds. Offerings to deities included agricultural products, animals for sacrifice, and valuable objects. The palaces themselves may have been partially conceived as offerings to the gods, their great scale and beauty an act of devotion, as well as a display of power and wealth. Certain individuals appear to have served as religious functionaries. Whether Minoan society had a professional priesthood is uncertain, but clearly some people had special religious roles. Priestesses are depicted in frescoes and on seal stones, recognizable by their distinctive dress and context. Some scholars have argued that the rulers of the palaces also served as chief priests or priestesses, combining political and religious authority. The famous throne room at Knossos has been interpreted by some as a place where a priestess or priest king underwent ritual transformation or epiphany, becoming a vehicle for divine presence. The throne, flanked by frescoes of griffins, faces a sunken lustral basin where purification rituals may have occurred. Whether the person who sat on that throne was a political ruler, a religious leader, or both remains uncertain. Minoan funerary practices provide additional insight into religious beliefs. The Minoans buried their dead in various types of tombs depending on period, location, and social status. Chamber tombs cut into soft rock were common. Tholos tombs, circular stone structures covered with earth, were used in southern Crete. Larnax, clay coffins or chests were used for individual burials. Grave goods accompanied the dead, suggesting belief in some form of afterlife. The quantity and quality of grave goods varied greatly, with elite burials containing valuable objects including gold jewelry, fine pottery, stone vessels, and weapons. More modest burials might contain just a few simple pottery vessels. Some burials show evidence of ritual activity after interment. Tombs were reopened for additional burials or for ceremonies. offerings were left in tombs long after the original burial. This suggests ongoing relationships between the living and the dead, perhaps a cult of ancestors or continued veneration of deceased family members. The Minoans also practiced unusual funerary rituals in some contexts. At some sites, particularly in the earlier periods, bones of the dead were collected after the flesh had decomposed and stored in communal ossuaries. This practice suggests different concepts of individual versus collective identity in death. Religious festivals probably marked the agricultural year. Offerings of first fruits, celebrations of harvest, rituals to ensure fertility of fields and flocks, all would have been important to an agricultural society. The exact timing and nature of these festivals is unknown, but comparison with later Greek practices and with other agricultural societies suggests their probable existence. Pilgrimage may have been practiced. The location of peak sanctuaries on mountaintops requiring effort to reach suggests that visiting them was itself part of the religious experience. The journey to a sanctuary, the climb up the mountain, the spectacular views from the summit, all would have contributed to the spiritual experience. The religious calendar may have been tied to astronomical observations. Some Minoan structures show alignments with solar or stellar events, though the evidence is not as clear as at some other ancient sites. The Minoans certainly observed the heavens and recognized seasonal patterns, knowledge essential for agriculture and navigation. Chapter 4: Society and Daily Life. While the palaces and religious sanctuaries reveal much about elite Minoan culture, understanding the daily lives of ordinary Minoans requires looking beyond these grand structures. The Minoans lived in a complex, stratified society where social status determined much about one's life experience. At the apex of Minoan society stood the rulers of the palaces. Whether these rulers were kings, queens, or religious leaders combining secular and sacred authority remains debated. No contemporary Minoan text describes their role or title in language we can understand. Later Greek myths spoke of King Minos of Knossos, but whether this represented a historical ruler, a title held by successive rulers, or a purely mythological figure is uncertain. What is clear is that someone organized and controlled the palace centers. Someone commanded the resources to build these massive structures. Someone directed the extensive economic activities recorded on Linear A tablets. Whether this was a single ruler, a council of elites, or a powerful priesthood, these leaders occupied the highest social stratum. Below the rulers came a class of palace administrators and religious functionaries. Linear A tablets record titles and roles we cannot fully understand, but which clearly represent specialized administrative positions. Seal stones, used to mark documents and storage vessels with a distinctive impression, were apparently symbols of office. The bearer of a particular seal had authority to act in certain capacities. Craftspeople formed another important social group. The Minoans were master craftspeople, as the quality of their artifacts demonstrates. Potters, stone carvers, metal workers, fresco painters, weavers, and many other specialists practiced their trades. Some craftspeople probably worked directly for the palaces, receiving rations in exchange for their labour. Others may have worked independently, trading their products for food and other goods. Workshops have been identified in towns, sometimes within or adjacent to palaces, other times in residential areas. A potter's workshop at Knossos contained kilns, clay preparation areas, and storerooms for finished vessels. A stone workshop at Malea had raw materials, partially finished vessels, and tools. These workshops show that craft production was organized and relatively specialized, with dedicated spaces and equipment. Merchants and traders formed another significant group. While we cannot know the details of commercial organization, the extent of Minoan trade argues for specialized merchants. Someone had to organize shipping, negotiate exchanges, and maintain trading relationships across the Mediterranean. These individuals likely accumulated significant wealth and social prestige. Farmers and herders formed the majority of the Minoan population. These were the people who produced the food that supported the civilization. They cultivated the fields, tended the olive groves and vineyards, and herded the flocks. Most lived in small agricultural villages scattered across the Cretan countryside. Archaeological survey has identified hundreds of small rural sites dating to the Minoan period. These villages typically consisted of a few dozen houses, built of stone and mud brick, with associated fields and animal pens. Life in these villages would have been centered on the agricultural cycle, with hard physical labor occupying most days. Farmers grew primarily wheat and barley, the staple grains. Legumes including lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans provided protein. Grapes for wine and olives for oil were major crops, both for local consumption and for exchange. Figs, pomegranates, and other fruits supplemented the diet. Agriculture on Crete faced challenges. Water was scarce in summer. Terracing was necessary on hillsides to prevent erosion and maximize usable land. Irrigation may have been practiced in some areas, though evidence is limited. Storage of agricultural surplus to survive crop failures was essential. Animal husbandry was important. Sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and wool. Cattle pulled ploughs and provided meat and hides. Pigs were raised for meat. All of these animals appear in artistic representations, and their bones are common in excavations. The Minoans also relied on the sea for food. Fish bones from excavations show that various species were consumed. Murex shells found in large quantities at some sites were used to produce purple dye, a valuable commodity in the ancient world. Seafood would have been particularly important for coastal communities. Women held important positions in Minoan society, at least among the elite. Female figures dominate Minoan religious art, suggesting that women had prominent roles in religion. Some scholars have argued that Minoan society was matriarchal, or at least matrilineal, though the evidence is not conclusive. Frescoes depict women participating in public ceremonies and religious rituals. The Ladies in Blue fresco from Knossos shows elegantly dressed women, possibly attending a ceremony. Women are shown as priestesses, as bull leapers alongside men, and in various other active roles. This contrasts with the more restricted roles of women in some later Mediterranean societies. However, caution is necessary in interpreting this evidence. Elite women clearly had status and visibility, but this may not reflect the lives of ordinary women. Agricultural labour was probably divided along gender lines in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. Textile production, attested by numerous loom weights and spindle whorls, was likely primarily women's work, as in most ancient societies. Children appear occasionally in Minoan art, though less frequently than adults. Some frescoes show what may be initiation ceremonies for young people. Certain figurines depict children. Toys, including clay animals and wheeled carts, have been found in excavations. These sparse remains hint at childhood, but tell us little about child-rearing practices or education. Minoan dress, as depicted in frescoes and figurines, was distinctive. Men typically wore short kilts or loincloths. These were often elaborate, made of patterned fabric and secured with decorated belts. Men's upper bodies were usually bare, though sometimes cloaks or shawls were worn. Men's hairstyles varied, with long curls being fashionable at some periods. Women's dress was more complex. The typical female costume consisted of a long, bell-shaped skirt with multiple tiers or flounces. These skirts were often elaborately patterned. The bodice was fitted, sometimes laced, and cut to expose the breasts. Over this, women sometimes wore a short jacket or bolero. This style of dress appears shocking to modern sensibilities, but it was apparently the respectable fashion for Minoan women, at least in ceremonial contexts. Women's hairstyles were elaborate. Hair was often long and curly, sometimes piled on top of the head, other times flowing down the back. Hair was adorned with ribbons, beads, and ornaments. The famous Parisienne fresco shows a woman with a complex hairstyle featuring a knot at the back of the head and curls framing the face. Both men and women wore jewellery. Necklaces of gold, semi-precious stones, and faience beads have been found in burials. Bracelets, anklets, and rings were worn. Earrings and hair ornaments added further decoration. The quality and quantity of jewellery varied with social status, with elite burials containing spectacular pieces. Cosmetics were apparently used. Some frescoes show figures with reddened lips and cheeks, suggesting makeup. Small containers that may have held cosmetics have been found. Whether these practices were widespread or limited to elites is uncertain. Daily life, for most Minoans, revolved around work. In the towns, craftspeople spent their days at their trades. Potters threw vessels on the wheel, a technology the Minoans adopted around 2000 before the Common Era. The potter's wheel allowed for faster production of more uniform vessels compared to hand-building techniques. Metal workers smelted copper ore, mixed it with tin to create bronze, and then cast or hammered it into tools, weapons, and ornaments. The techniques of lost wax casting, where a wax model is covered in clay, then melted out and replaced with molten metal, allowed for complex shapes. Hammering and annealing, repeatedly heating and beating the metal, could produce thin sheets for ornaments. Stone carvers worked slowly and carefully to transform hard stone into delicate vessels. This required skill, patience, and specialized tools, including abrasives like emery. A single stone vessel might represent days or weeks of labor. Weavers created textiles on looms. While no Minoan textiles survive, the elaborate costumes depicted in frescoes and the thousands of loom weights found in excavations attest to extensive textile production. Wool from sheep and goats was spun into thread, then woven into cloth. Flax may have been grown and processed to make linen. Dyes from plants and from murex shells coloured the fabric. In the countryside, agricultural labour followed the seasons. Winter was the time for ploughing and planting. Spring brought the grain harvest. Summer was for tending grapevines and olive trees. Autumn brought the grape harvest and winemaking, followed by olive harvest and oil production. This cycle repeated year after year, generation after generation. Food processing required significant labour. Grain had to be threshed to separate kernels from chaff, then winnowed to remove the chaff, then ground into flour. This grinding was done by hand, using stone querns or mortars and pestles. It was time-consuming, physically demanding work, probably assigned to women and slaves if the Minoans kept slaves, which is uncertain. Olive oil production was a major industry. Olives were crushed to release their oil. Then the resulting paste was pressed to extract as much oil as possible. Large installations for olive processing have been found at various sites, with stone crushing basins and pressing equipment. The oil was stored in pithoi and other containers for later use or trade. Wine production similarly required processing facilities. Grapes were crushed, possibly by treading, then the juice was fermented in large vessels. The wine was stored in jars sealed with clay stoppers. Minoan wine was an important trade commodity and was probably consumed widely within Crete. Meals for ordinary Minoans probably consisted primarily of bread or porridge made from barley or wheat, supplemented with legumes, vegetables, and small amounts of meat or fish. Olive oil flavoured food and provided important calories. Wine, probably diluted with water as was common in later Greek practice, was the usual beverage. Cheese made from sheep or goat milk added protein and flavour. Elite meals were undoubtedly more elaborate. The harvester vase and other artefacts suggest feasting and drinking as important social activities. Large quantities of fine pottery for serving food and drink have been found in palaces, suggesting elaborate dining. Imported delicacies may have graced elite tables. Housing for most Minoans was relatively simple. In villages, houses were small, often consisting of just a few rooms. Walls were built of stone lower courses with mud brick above. Roofs were probably flat, made of wooden beams covered with branches, reeds, and earth. These roofs could be used as additional living or working space in good weather. In towns, houses were larger and more complex, especially for wealthier families. Multi-story houses with numerous rooms have been excavated. These might include dedicated areas for different activities: storage rooms, work areas, cooking areas, and sleeping quarters. Some houses had light wells for illumination and air. Drainage systems carried away wastewater. Furniture was probably simple for most people. Benches built against walls provided seating. Raised platforms may have served as beds. Clay or wooden chests stored possessions. The elite had more elaborate furniture, including the carved gypsum throne found at Knossos. Tables, chairs, and couches appear in some artistic representations. Lighting came from oil lamps, simple pottery vessels with a wick floating in olive oil. Numerous lamps have been found in excavations. Fireplaces and braziers provided heat and light, though Crete's mild climate made heating less critical than in more northern regions. Water was carried from wells or springs in pottery vessels. In larger towns, some houses had access to piped water supplies. The Palace at Knossos had an elaborate water system that brought water from springs several kilometers away through terracotta pipes. This water supplied fountains and possibly bathing facilities. Sanitation in Minoan towns appears to have been relatively sophisticated. Drains ran beneath streets, carrying away wastewater and storm water. Some houses had indoor toilets with drains that connected to the larger sewage system. This level of urban infrastructure would not be matched in Europe again for many centuries after the Minoans. Social interactions included festivals, ceremonies, and gatherings that brought communities together. The large central courts of palaces could have accommodated crowds of spectators for ceremonial events. If bull leaping was practiced, it would have been a spectacular public performance. Religious festivals brought people to peak sanctuaries and other sacred sites. Music and dance were part of Minoan culture. Frescoes show figures in poses suggesting dance. Small clay figurines depict musicians playing lyres and other instruments. While we cannot hear Minoan music, we can be confident that it played a role in religious ceremonies, festivals, and perhaps entertainment. Games and entertainment remain largely mysterious. A board game of some kind is suggested by decorated stone slabs that may have been game boards, though how they were played is unknown. The Minoans probably told stories, sang songs, and engaged in various pastimes, but direct evidence is scarce. Travel within Crete was mostly on foot or by donkey. The Minoans built roads connecting settlements, though these were not paved highways but rather cleared paths. Causeways spanned some streams. The mountainous terrain made travel challenging, but clearly people moved around the island regularly. Maritime travel was common. The Minoans were expert sailors, as their extensive trade networks demonstrate. Ships connected Crete to the wider world, carrying goods and people across the Mediterranean. The ships themselves are known primarily from artistic representations, as no Minoan shipwreck has been definitively identified and excavated. Artistic representations show ships with both sails and oars. They appear to have been relatively small by modern standards, perhaps capable of carrying a few dozen people or a few tons of cargo. Navigation relied on landmarks when coasting, and on knowledge of winds, currents, and stars when crossing open water. Life expectancy was probably relatively short by modern standards, as was typical in antiquity. Skeletal evidence suggests many Minoans died in their 30s or 40s. Infant and child mortality was likely high. Those who survived childhood had better chances of reaching middle age, but chronic malnutrition, disease, and hard physical labour took their toll. Disease undoubtedly affected the Minoans, though direct evidence is limited. Skeletal remains show some evidence of malnutrition, arthritis, and injuries. Infectious diseases probably swept through the population periodically, though we have no Minoan accounts of epidemics. Medical practice remains mysterious. Whether the Minoans had specialized healers or medical knowledge is unknown. Chapter 5. The Military and Warfare. One of the most puzzling aspects of Minoan civilization is the apparent absence of militaristic elements that characterize many ancient societies. As mentioned earlier, Minoan palaces and towns lacked defensive fortifications. Weapons are relatively rare in Minoan art and archaeology compared to contemporary civilizations. This has led some scholars to characterize the Minoans as a peaceful, perhaps even pacifistic society. However, this characterization is probably overly simplistic. The Minoans certainly had weapons and likely engaged in conflict, even if the nature and scale of that conflict differs from what we see in other Bronze Age societies. Weapons that have been found include daggers, swords, spears, and arrows. Bronze daggers are relatively common finds, both in settlements and in burials. These ranged from simple utilitarian blades to elaborate ceremonial weapons with decorated hilts and pommels. Some daggers had hilts adorned with gold or ivory. Swords appear during the later Minoan periods. These were relatively short by modern standards, typically around 20 to 24 inches in blade length. They were designed primarily for cutting rather than thrusting. The hilts were often decorated, suggesting that swords served as status symbols as well as weapons. The famous swords from the palace at Malea, with rock crystal pommels, are spectacular examples of Minoan weapons craftsmanship. These were clearly prestige items, weapons for elite warriors, or perhaps ceremonial objects, rather than battlefield weapons. Spears are less common in the archaeological record, perhaps because they were made primarily of wood, with only the point being metal. Spearheads of bronze have been found, suggesting that spears were used for hunting and possibly warfare. Arrows and bows were used. Bronze arrowheads have been found at numerous sites. The bow appears in artistic representations, though not as frequently as in some contemporary cultures. Archery was probably used primarily for hunting. Defensive equipment is even rarer than offensive weapons. Shields appear in some artistic representations. The famous figure of 8 shield, so called because of its distinctive shape, appears repeatedly in Minoan art. These shields were apparently made of ox hide stretched over a wooden frame. They were large enough to cover most of the body, but light enough to be carried. Helmets rarely appear in Minoan contexts before the later period of mainland influence. When they do appear, they include the distinctive boar's tusk helmet, where rows of boar tusks were attached to a leather cap. This type of helmet would later be famous in Mycenaean Greece and is described in Homer's Iliad. Body armour is essentially absent from early Minoan contexts. This suggests that if warfare occurred, it was not the heavily armed infantry combat of later Greek hoplite warfare. Combat may have been more individualistic, perhaps involving dueling or small-scale raids rather than massed formations. The question of who fought for the Minoans remains uncertain. Were there professional warriors, a citizen militia, or both? Elite burials sometimes contain weapons, suggesting that at least some members of the upper class had military roles or pretensions. Whether ordinary people served as soldiers is unknown. Some scholars have suggested that young athletes who performed bull leaping and other dangerous ritual activities may have also served as warriors. The athletic training, courage, and discipline required for bull leaping would translate well to warfare. However, this remains speculation. Naval forces were probably more important than land forces for the Minoans. Control of the seas would have been essential for an island trading civilization. Later Greek myths spoke of King Minos establishing a thalassocracy, a sea empire, controlling the Aegean through naval power. While these myths were written centuries after the Minoan period, they may preserve some memory of Minoan naval dominance. Ships could serve as both merchant vessels and warships. Artistic representations do not clearly distinguish between the two, possibly because the distinction was minimal. A merchant ship could carry warriors, and a warship could carry cargo. Oars would have made these ships capable of manoeuvring in combat, not dependent solely on wind. Naval warfare in the Bronze Age Mediterranean probably involved ramming and boarding. Ships would attempt to hole enemy vessels below the waterline or come alongside to allow warriors to board. Archers might shoot at enemy crews from a distance. It was brutal, dangerous work. Piracy was probably common in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Any trading vessel might be attacked by pirates. Conversely, a powerful state might engage in what amounted to state-sponsored piracy, raiding weaker neighbours. Whether the Minoans engaged in such activities or were primarily victims of others' piracy is uncertain. The absence of fortifications at Minoan sites requires explanation if the Minoans faced external threats. Several theories have been proposed. Perhaps Minoan naval power was so dominant that no enemy could mount a serious attack on Crete itself. The island's geography, with limited good landing beaches, could be defended by a navy that intercepted invasions before they landed. Alternatively, perhaps fortifications were unnecessary because major warfare simply did not characterize the Minoan period. If conflicts were limited to small-scale raids or disputes settled through ritual combat or negotiation, massive walls would be unnecessary extravagances. Some scholars have noted that the palaces themselves, with their massive walls and controlled entrances, could serve defensive functions without being specifically designed as fortresses. In an emergency, the population might retreat into the palace, which could be defended for a time. Internal conflict within Crete may have occurred. The relationship between the various palace centres is uncertain. Were they independent states that sometimes competed or fought with each other? Were they part of a unified political system under a high king at Knossos? Did their relationship change over time? No clear evidence of warfare between the palace centres has been found. They all show similar destruction layers at certain periods, suggesting common catastrophes like earthquakes rather than conquest of one palace by another. However, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Linear A tablets provide some tantalizing hints about military organization. Some tablets list what may be groups of men, possibly military units or work gangs. Others record spears or other items that might be military equipment. However, without being able to read Linear A, we cannot know for certain what these records describe. Fortifications did eventually appear in Crete, but primarily during the later Minoan period when Mycenaean influence was strong. Sites from the period after approximately 1500 before the Common Era sometimes show defensive walls. This change may reflect increased militarism, perhaps under Mycenaean rulers, or response to increased external threats. The relationship between ritual and warfare in Minoan culture may have been closer than in modern societies. Weapons, especially elaborate daggers and swords, appear in religious contexts. They may have been offered to deities or used in ceremonies. The distinction between sacred and martial may have been blurred. Bull leaping, if practiced, was certainly dangerous and required courage, training, and discipline, qualities useful in warfare. The ritual may have served partly as military training or as a way to demonstrate martial virtues in a ceremonial context. Young people who excelled at bull leaping may have been expected to become warriors if needed. Hunting was another activity that combined ritual significance with military training. The Master of Animals iconography suggests that hunting was not merely practical but also ceremonial. Skill in hunting demonstrated mastery over nature and courage in facing dangerous animals, qualities a warrior should possess. The Minoans may have relied more on diplomacy than military force to achieve their goals. Gift exchange, marriage alliances, and trade relationships could secure cooperation from other states without warfare. The extensive Minoan trade network may have been maintained primarily through such peaceful means, with military force reserved for dealing with pirates or other criminals. Tribute or taxation systems may have supported the palace's wealth and power. Rural settlements, and perhaps subject territories, sent agricultural products and other goods to the palace centres. Whether this was voluntary, based on religious obligation or traditional loyalty, or enforced through threat of military action, is unknown. The Minoans certainly had the capacity for organised violence. They had weapons, they had warriors of some kind, and they had ships that could project power. But the archaeological evidence suggests that warfare was not central to their society in the way it was for some of their neighbours and successors. Whether this reflects genuine cultural differences, different strategic circumstances, or simply gaps in our evidence base remains debated. Chapter 6: Twilight of the Palaces. The Minoan civilization reached its height during the Neo-Palatial period, but this golden age would not last forever. Around 1500 before the Common Era, the palaces faced a series of disasters that would fundamentally transform Minoan society and ultimately lead to its incorporation into the emerging Mycenaean world. The exact sequence and causes of these disasters remain controversial among scholars. Multiple factors appear to have been involved: natural catastrophes, political changes, and the growing power of the Mycenaean Greeks on the mainland. One of the most dramatic events was the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, an island about 70 miles north of Crete. This eruption was one of the largest in recorded human history, comparable to the famous eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The explosion blew out the center of the island, creating the caldera that exists today. Volcanic ash from the eruption has been found across the eastern Mediterranean. The eruption buried the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri on Thera under meters of ash and pumice, preserving it like Pompeii for modern archaeologists. The remarkably preserved frescoes and artifacts from Akrotiri provide invaluable insights into Minoan life. But what effect did the eruption have on Crete itself? The dating of the Thera eruption has been controversial. Radiocarbon dating suggests a date around 1630 to 1600 before the Common Era. Archaeological evidence from pottery sequences suggests a date around 1500 before the Common Era. This approximately 100-year discrepancy remains unresolved and has major implications for understanding the eruption's impact on Minoan civilization. The eruption would have produced immediate effects felt across the region. A massive column of ash would have risen into the atmosphere, possibly causing temporary cooling and crop failures. Tsunamis generated by the collapse of the volcanic cone would have struck Crete's northern coast. Ashfall would have covered eastern Crete, though probably not thick enough to make the land uninhabitable. Some scholars have argued that the Thera eruption dealt a catastrophic blow to Minoan civilization, destroying the navy, devastating coastal settlements, and disrupting agriculture. However, the archaeological evidence does not show a collapse of Minoan civilization immediately following the eruption, whenever it occurred. The palaces continued to function, and Minoan culture remained vibrant. The relationship between the Thera eruption and the destructions at Minoan sites is complex. Many sites show destruction layers from approximately 1500 before the Common Era, but the exact dates are difficult to determine precisely enough to know if these destructions were simultaneous or spread over several decades. Around 1450 to 1400 before the Common Era, clear evidence of major changes appears. The the Palace of Knossos shows signs of destruction followed by rebuilding and modification. Crucially, the new phase at Knossos shows Mycenaean cultural elements. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, appears in the palace archives, replacing Linear A. This Linear B can be read, and it is an early form of Greek. The other major palaces appear to have been destroyed around this time and were not rebuilt on the same scale. Phaistos, Malea and Zakros all show destruction layers. Some sites show evidence of burning. Whether these destructions resulted from earthquakes, warfare, social upheaval, or some combination is debated. The appearance of Linear B at Knossos suggests that Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland had taken control of the palace. Whether this occurred through military conquest, political takeover, or gradual infiltration is uncertain. The Linear B tablets at Knossos record administrative details similar to those recorded in Linear A, but now in Greek. The palace bureaucracy continued, but under new management. The Mycenaeans were not destroyers of Minoan culture, but rather enthusiastic adopters of it. Mycenaean culture shows strong Minoan influence in art, architecture, and religion. The Mycenaeans borrowed the Minoan palace layout, artistic styles, and religious symbols. They adopted Minoan pottery forms and decorative motifs. In many ways, Mycenaean civilization was a fusion of mainland traditions with Minoan culture. The nature of Mycenaean control over Crete is debated. Did a Mycenaean dynasty rule from Knossos, controlling the whole island? Or did Mycenaean Greeks control only certain sites, while indigenous Minoan communities maintained independence in other areas? The archaeological evidence allows for different interpretations. Knossos continued to function as a major centre under Mycenaean control. The palace was modified, with some areas rebuilt in styles showing mainland influence. The Linear B archive from Knossos, dating to approximately 1375 to 1350 before the Common Era, records administration of significant territories and resources. Thousands of tablets document livestock, agricultural products, personnel, religious offerings, and military equipment. These Linear B tablets provide fascinating details about late Minoan or early Mycenaean Crete. They record place names, many of which can be identified with later known sites. They list occupations and social categories. They document religious practices, including offerings to deities whose names would later be familiar in classical Greek religion, including Zeus, Hera, Athena, and Poseidon, alongside deities unknown from later periods. Military equipment recorded in the Linear B tablets includes chariots, armour, and weapons, suggesting a more militarized society than earlier Minoan culture. Chariots, in particular, were a Mycenaean innovation not previously used in Crete. The tablets record chariot wheels, harnesses, and associated equipment. The relationship between the Mycenaean rulers and the local population is uncertain. Did the indigenous Minoans accept Mycenaean rule, resist it, or some of each? Were Mycenaean and Minoan populations integrated or segregated? Did intermarriage occur? These social details are difficult to extract from archaeological evidence. Around 1300 to 1350 before the Common Era, the Palace of Knossos was finally destroyed and not rebuilt. The exact cause is uncertain. Earthquake, warfare, and internal revolt have all been suggested. After this destruction, Knossos continued to be occupied, but as a town rather than a palace centre. The age of the Minoan palaces was definitively over. Other sites across Crete show disturbances and changes during this period. Some sites were abandoned, others continued but with decreased prosperity. New sites, often located on hilltops with better defensive positions, were established. This pattern suggests increasing insecurity and possibly warfare. The period from approximately 1300 to 1100 before the Common Era was one of general upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean. This was the age of the Late Bronze Age collapse, when many of the great civilizations of the region declined or fell. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Mycenaean palace centers on the Greek mainland were destroyed. Cities in the Levant were burned. Egypt faced invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples. Crete did not escape this general crisis. The archaeological record shows population decline, settlement abandonment, and cultural change. Trade networks that had connected Crete to the wider world contracted or collapsed. The elaborate luxury goods of earlier periods became rare. Some Cretans fled the island during this period of crisis. Cretan refugees or migrants may have contributed to the Sea Peoples who ravaged the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian records mention groups with names that might refer to Cretans or Aegean peoples among the Sea Peoples. In the mountains of central and eastern Crete, some communities maintained traditional ways of life into this period and beyond. Sites in more remote areas show continuity from the Minoan period through the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse. These communities preserved elements of Minoan culture, language, and religion that would influence later Cretan society. The Eteocratan language, known from a few inscriptions of the first millennium before the Common Era, may have been a survival of the Minoan language. These inscriptions, written in Greek letters but in a non-Greek language, are too few and too brief to allow translation, but they hint at cultural continuity from the Bronze Age. By 1100 before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization had effectively ended. Crete entered a Dark Age, similar to that experienced across Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. Population declined dramatically. Literacy was lost, with neither Linear A nor Linear B continuing in use. The arts of fresco painting and stone carving declined. Trade decreased to a fraction of its former volume. Yet, Minoan cultural influences persisted. When Greek civilization re-emerged in the Archaic period, beginning around 800 before the Common Era, Cretan culture retained distinctive elements that may have had Bronze Age roots. Certain religious practices, artistic motifs, and cultural traditions may have been transmitted through the Dark Age. The Greeks of the classical period preserved memories of Bronze Age Crete in their myths. King Minos, the Minotaur in the Labyrinth, Theseus and Ariadne, Daedalus and Icarus, all these famous stories were set in Bronze Age Crete. How much historical reality lies behind these myths is debated, but they suggest that the Greeks remembered Crete as having been a major power in the distant past. The decline and fall of Minoan civilization was not caused by a single catastrophic event, but rather by a combination of factors acting over centuries. Natural disasters, including earthquakes and possibly the Thera eruption, created crises. The rise of Mycenaean power led to political takeover. Changes in Mediterranean trade patterns may have undermined economic prosperity. The general Bronze Age collapse affected Crete as it did the entire eastern Mediterranean. What is remarkable is not that Minoan civilization fell, but that it flourished for so long and achieved so much. For over 1,000 years, the Minoans created a sophisticated culture that influenced the entire Aegean world and beyond. Chapter 7: Rediscovery and Legacy. For over 3,000 years, the Minoan civilization lay hidden beneath the earth of Crete. Occasional artifacts surfaced, strange objects that local people could not identify. The mythical stories of King Minos and the Labyrinth were told and retold, but no one connected these myths to actual ruins beneath the ground. In the late 19th century, archaeology was becoming a systematic scientific discipline. Heinrich Schliemann had made his famous discoveries at Troy and Mycenae, showing that the legendary cities of Homer's epics were real places. Scholars began to wonder whether other legendary sites might also be real. A Cretan merchant and antiquarian named Minos Kalokairenos began excavating at Kephala Hill near Heraklion in 1878. He uncovered storage magazines and large pithoi, realizing he had found something significant. However, political complications related to Crete's status as part of the Ottoman Empire prevented extensive excavation at this time. The true rediscovery of Minoan civilization began in 1900 when Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist and scholar, began systematic excavations at Kephala Hill, the site of ancient Knossos. Evans had become interested in ancient Crete through studying mysterious pictographic seals. He believed an advanced civilization must have existed on the island to produce such artifacts. Evans purchased the site and began excavations on March 23, 1900. Almost immediately, spectacular finds emerged. Frescoes, pottery, tablets with writing, architectural remains of a vast complex, all came to light. Evans realized he had discovered a major Bronze Age civilization previously unknown to modern scholarship. Evans named this civilization Minoan, after the legendary King Minos. He would spend the next 3 decades excavating and reconstructing the Palace of Knossos. His work was groundbreaking, but also controversial, particularly his extensive reconstructions, which mixed ancient remains with modern materials in ways that sometimes made it difficult to distinguish what was original from what was restoration. Evans's reconstructions at Knossos, particularly the famous painted columns and the upper story rooms, have been both praised for making the site accessible and understandable to visitors and criticized for imposing Evans's interpretations on the ancient remains. Some of his reconstructions are now known to be incorrect, but they have become iconic images of Minoan civilization. Evans developed a chronological framework for Minoan civilization, dividing it into early, middle, and late Minoan periods, each with subdivisions. This framework, with modifications, is still used today, though it has been supplemented by more precise dating methods, including radiocarbon dating. Other archaeologists soon began work at other sites on Crete. Italian archaeologists excavated Phaistos and Hagia Triada. French archaeologists worked at Malea. American archaeologist Harriet Boyd Hawes excavated Gornia, becoming one of the first female archaeologists to lead a major excavation. Greek archaeologists, including Stephanos Xanthidides and Spiridon Marinatos, made important discoveries. The decipherment of Linear B in 1952 by Michael Ventris and John Chadwick revolutionized understanding of late Bronze Age Crete and Greece. Ventris demonstrated that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek, meaning that the final phase of Knossos was under Greek-speaking Mycenaean control. However, Linear A, the script of the earlier Minoan palaces, remains undeciphered to this day, despite many attempts. The eruption of Thera was recognized in the 1960s when Spiridon Marinatos began excavations at Akrotiri. The spectacular frescoes and well-preserved buildings revealed a Minoan-influenced culture frozen in time by the volcanic eruption. The Thera eruption and its possible effects on Minoan civilization became a major topic of archaeological debate. In recent decades, new excavation techniques and scientific methods have expanded our knowledge. Geophysical survey allows archaeologists to locate buried structures without excavation. Environmental archaeology provides information about ancient climate, agriculture, and diet. DNA analysis of human remains is beginning to provide information about Minoan population origins and movements. Excavations continue across Crete. New sites are discovered. Old sites yield new information through more careful excavation and analysis. Understanding of Minoan civilization continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and new interpretations are proposed. The legacy of Minoan civilization extends far beyond academic archaeology. The visual imagery of Minoan art has influenced modern design and aesthetics. The mysterious quality of Minoan culture has inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers. The idea of a peaceful, goddess-worshipping, artistically sophisticated Bronze Age civilization has appealed to many modern people seeking alternatives to militaristic, patriarchal models of civilization. Some of these modern interpretations romanticize or distort Minoan culture. Claims that the Minoans were completely peaceful, entirely matriarchal, or possessed advanced technology are not supported by archaeological evidence. The Minoans were complex Bronze Age people, neither utopian paragons nor primitive barbarians, but humans with strengths and flaws like all societies. The connection between Minoan Crete and the legend of Atlantis has been suggested by some writers. Plato's account of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe, has some parallels with Minoan Crete and the Thera eruption. However, Plato explicitly located Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and described events supposedly 9,000 years before his time, far earlier than the Minoans. Most scholars view the Atlantis story as Plato's philosophical invention rather than a historical account. Minoan civilization influenced the development of Greek culture. The Mycenaean Greeks, who eventually dominated the Aegean, borrowed heavily from Minoan culture. Greek religion preserved elements that may have originated in Minoan Crete, including certain goddesses, sacred symbols, and ritual practices. Greek myths set many important stories in Crete, suggesting the island's significance in Greek cultural memory. The architectural legacy of Minoan civilization is visible in later Greek buildings. The central courtyard plan influenced later Mediterranean architecture. The use of columns, particularly the distinctive Minoan column that tapers downward, appeared in various later contexts. Advanced water management systems may have influenced later Greek and Roman engineering. Minoan artistic styles influenced Aegean art for centuries. Spiral motifs, marine imagery, and naturalistic plant and animal depictions all appeared first or prominently in Minoan art before being adopted elsewhere. The Minoan aesthetic sense, emphasizing movement, life, and natural forms over rigid stylization, offered an alternative to the more static art of Egypt and the Near East. The Minoans demonstrated that complex civilization could develop in a maritime setting based on trade and seafaring rather than large river valleys and extensive agricultural land. Their model of island-based thalassocracy influenced later Greek city-states and other Mediterranean cultures. Modern Crete maintains connections to its Minoan past. The Palace of Knossos is a major tourist attraction visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually. Museums in Heraklion and other Cretan cities house Minoan artifacts. Minoan symbols, particularly the double axe, appear in modern Cretan cultural contexts. The Minoans are a source of pride and identity for modern Cretans. Internationally, Minoan civilization captures imaginations. The elegant artistry, the mysterious writing system, the legendary associations, all contribute to enduring fascination. Every year brings new visitors to Crete, new students to Minoan archaeology, new scholars to Minoan studies. Questions remain unanswered. We still cannot read Linear A or understand the Minoan language. We do not fully understand Minoan political organization or religious beliefs. The relationships between different Minoan sites and between Crete and other regions remain debated. The exact sequence of events during the civilization's decline is still uncertain. Future discoveries will undoubtedly modify our understanding. Excavations at new sites or new areas of known sites may yield unexpected information. Improved scientific techniques may allow analysis impossible today. Decipherment of Linear A, should it occur, would revolutionize Minoan studies as the decipherment of Linear B did. The Minoans created the first complex civilization in Europe. They built magnificent palaces, created beautiful art, developed writing systems, and established extensive trade networks. For over 1,000 years, their culture flourished on Crete and influenced the wider Mediterranean world. Though their civilization eventually fell, their legacy lived on, influencing the Greeks and through them the entire Western tradition. As you drift toward sleep, imagine standing in the central court of the Palace of Knossos on a warm Mediterranean afternoon 3,500 years ago. Painted columns rise around you, their red capitals supporting upper stories decorated with colourful frescoes. The scent of olive oil and incense hangs in the air. Somewhere, a priestess prepares for an evening ceremony. In the storage magazines, row upon row of pithoi hold the wealth of the harvest. Ships in the harbour are being loaded for voyages to distant lands. The civilization is at its height, prosperous and confident, unaware that centuries of change and challenge lie ahead. This is the world of the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization, mysterious and magnificent, whose rediscovery over a century ago continues to reveal the wonders of the ancient Aegean. From their uncertain beginnings in the early Bronze Age, through the glory of the Palace period, to their eventual incorporation into the Mycenaean world, the Minoans created a culture that still captivates us today. Now, as we close this long journey through Minoan history, let your mind rest with these images of ancient Crete. The rhythmic waves on the shores, the rustle of olive groves in the breeze, the quiet corridors of the labyrinthine palaces. Let the distant past carry you peacefully into sleep. This has been Sleepless History. Thank you for listening, and good night.